One number which blew my mind, and we found that the upstream supply chain emissions are actually 21 times higher than the direct emissions.
Pierre, Dexter, hello. Thanks so much for joining me this year. We've just published a report, Turning Your Supply Chain into Climate Advantage. I'd love to hear from you and maybe Pierre-François a little bit about what the report headlines are.
So, Diana, first, the report is, I think, very interesting collaborations. We shared data with you on, more than 80,000 businesses, climate emissions and climate practices. And, you've been running a very interesting insights. So the focus of the report is, scope 3 and supply chain scope 3. And simply answering simple questions, what's the business case? Why, should we focus on the scope 3? And how can we do it more effectively? And why scope 3? Because we think, or we find in the report, it's actually the largest source of risk and managed emissions. One number which blew my mind, and we found that the upstream supply chain emissions are actually 21 times higher than the direct emissions.
Great. And you've kind of highlighted the scale of the impact. How are you seeing corporates manage that? What is some of the feedback that we're getting from the organizations?
So what we found in the data is, if scope 3 supply chain is 20 times higher, you would expect that corporates have a huge focus on that. It's actually the opposite. We found that they are half likely to set scope 3 target than they're setting their scope 1 and scope 2 targets. And what was very interesting for me is what we found also is when you combine this with the economic information, we found that the cost of those, I think, 13 gigatons of emissions will represent a liability of $500 billion. $500 billion if it was using the current carbon cost, which will translate, looking at Global 500, in EBIT reduction of 15 to 20% in the next, by 2030, I think. So, not managed the right way, and huge cost and huge opportunity to manage.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that stood out to me on the back of that analysis was the fact that so much of the activity that happens inside a corporate can actually be net positive from a cost perspective, because at $76 for cost of carbon, many of the actions on the margin abatement cost curve are actually in the money. And we were seeing that about 50% of the activities in the supply chain can have a 3 to 6 times ROI. So there's a real financial incentive for companies to pursue carbon reduction through their supply chain. So that was quite encouraging. So I'm hoping the CFOs also take note, not just the CSOs that are clients. Dexter, I think the report this year started to get into how, right? How do we reduce some of that footprint? I think there were 5 actions. Maybe do you want to just take us through those?
Absolutely. I loved the fact that it effectively validated the last 2 decades of my work. So I was super excited to see the key actions that we're really telling companies to focus on based on this data. So number 1, you need to engage your suppliers. This is critical. You need to actually ask the question of the supply base. Number 2, you need to measure the emissions. You need to make sure that you're actually capturing the emissions. You understand how you're measuring it and pushing that out across the supply chain. And don't reinvent the wheel. Okay? So you've got to use established standards to engage your suppliers, or else they'll be responding to millions of different questions. The third one is very much focused on making sure that we can have a target in place to make sure that we're actually measuring and managing these emissions across our supply chain. So a clear target that we communicate clearly to our supply base. Finally, you need a team to make this happen. Otherwise, you're not going to make it happen at all. So if there's no one there, no one's going to do the job. And finally, well, if you don't fund it, it's not going to happen either. So you need to allocate the resources. But interestingly, what we found out of all of these initiatives, the most effective is asking the question, actual supplier engagement. It means that a company is 9 times more likely to actually achieve their Scope 3 goals if they talk to their supply base. So you can't achieve this in isolation. You've got to have the conversation.
Thank you very much for your time today, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.